welcome to the Portsmouth Travel and Tourism Show. My name is Dave Schulte. I'm the tourism manager for the city of Portsmouth. In today's show, we're going to visit two attractions that draw people from Hampton Roads and the region. First, we'll go to the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center to see a terrific new exhibition about the 100th anniversary of World War I. Then we'll visit Wayback Yonder Antiques in Old Town. And then we'll wrap up today's show with a look at a new tourism video that shows all there is to see and do in Portsmouth.
Want to show your Portsmouth pride? Visit the Portsmouth Visitor Center to find all kinds of clothing and merchandise that proudly bears the Portsmouth logo. The Visitor Center is located in Old Town at North Harbor, next to the Renaissance Hotel. The staff will be happy to help you plan your visit and help you pick out clothing and gifts. Here you will find sweatshirts, t-shirts, fleece, caps, and all kinds of sportswear and gifts to show off your Portsmouth pride. The Visitor Center is open daily from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Please stop by to say hello.
This year marks the 100th anniversary of America's entry into World War I. Perhaps no city in America was more affected by that war than Portsmouth. There's a great new exhibition at the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center that documents the tremendous changes that took place in Portsmouth. Let's pay a visit to the exhibit now with the curator, Diane Cripps.
I'm Diane Cripps, and I'm the Curator of History for the Portsmouth Museums. Welcome, everyone. We are standing today in the main gallery on the second floor of the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center. Usually in my job, I focus on the history of Portsmouth, and we have 3 history museums that are in other places. But every few years, the History Division of the Museums Department gets to put a larger exhibit on display here at the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center. We're at High and Court Streets in the 1846 courthouse, right in Old Town Portsmouth. And so we're really excited this summer to be bringing you an exhibit that is exclusive to us here in the Museums Department in Portsmouth. It's based on original research, and it is about Portsmouth and World War I. It's called To Face the Unknown, Portsmouth and the Great War. If you think that that an exhibit about World War I includes things like trench warfare and machine guns, which it certainly did, we want you to think again if you're thinking of coming to visit this show, because this is about how Portsmouth and the Great War affected each other, because there was an amazing range of things that happened here in Portsmouth that had never happened before, and things that are still evident when you look around Portsmouth today. So we tried to focus very specifically on local history here in Portsmouth that had a global effect, and vice versa. So when you enter the exhibit, you'll get a brief refresh on what was happening in the war, which was originally called the European War in a lot of places, because the United States remained neutral for the first couple of years that the war actually broke out. So we have some displays that show you what was going on in Europe and how President Woodrow Wilson was actually begging the American public to remain neutral even in their thoughts and not take sides in this faraway war that was across the sea. And something very unusual happened in Portsmouth during that odd period of neutrality, and it happened right here on the shipyard in Portsmouth, what today is called Norfolk Naval Shipyard. In those days it was called Norfolk Navy Yard, and it's the story of the German village. And a lot of people might have heard about it but might not know the full story or why it's so unusual. And what was happening was the Germans were taking their luxury cruise liners, essentially, and outfitting them for war. So instead of being something that people would go on a vacation on, they were stripping all the luxury off the ships, arming them, manning them with sailors, and sending them out on the open Atlantic to steal, basically, supplies and coal from merchant ships from other countries. And they were getting more and more aggressive about it. And some of their ships were traveling worldwide. But of course, there weren't that many friendly ports to put into when you're essentially out on the open seas intent on, sinking and stealing. So there were 2 of these enormous ships, German ships, that wound up in Hampton Roads. Just like you can't drive a car too long without maintaining it, of course the same thing has to happen for a ship. And 2 of these enormous German ships wound up in the Hampton Roads area. Hey, we're a neutral port. Let's try to get in there and see if we can get some maintenance for our ships. They wound up at Newport News, what is today Newport News Shipbuilding. They had some maintenance on their ships, and then they had a choice to make. Did they want to go back out into the Atlantic where the English were waiting for them, pretty angry out there in the ocean, or did they want to submit to what was called interning, which was basically surrendering yourself to a neutral country. You weren't really prisoners of war, but you weren't really free to go and do as you pleased. So they decided to choose interning and wound up at the Navy Yard because they couldn't stay at a private shipyard. If they were going to be interned, they had to be at a government installation. So they wound up right here, about a mile away from where we're standing right now, at the shipyard, dockside. And now you've got nearly 1,000 German sailors with nothing to do. They were basically just parked, and sailors, like anybody else, have plenty of energy, plenty of creativity, and they started gathering scrap materials from the shipyard, and they started building little cottages reminiscent of their homeland. They built a church, they built a windmill, they built all kinds of fences and gardens, and one account says they had chickens and they planted, all kinds of vegetables. They opened what was essentially a tourist attraction right here in Portsmouth on the shipyard, and it was called the German Village. They even published a German newspaper, like a little newsletter about the goings-on at the village. It was called the Colony Anzeiger, and we have an original copy of it on display, which is relatively rare. And there were postcards that we have on display, and thousands of people came, not just from Portsmouth and Norfolk, but all around the area to tour the German village, to basically pay 10 cents and go meet these Germans, because there was a lot of curiosity about these sailors, and some of them actually had family in the area. I read one account that said one of the sailors, one of the first things that happened when the ships arrived at the shipyard was that he received a postcard from his aunt in Philadelphia welcoming him. And an account from the Popular Science magazine talked about how when the village was gone, that the entire South was the sufferer thereby after the village was no longer available as a tourist attraction. And of course that happened when the United States entered the war. That was April of 1916. So once that happened, once the United States finally got in the war, which basically had to do with all that German naval activity, the Germans started sinking American ships. Now things are getting a little closer to home. We had no more choice. We couldn't remain neutral. We entered the war. So once the U.S. entered the war, it was a whole different world. There was a war on. There was no more time for tourist attractions. There were, ships to be outfitted and sailors to be recruited and trained, and plenty of jobs to be done. And that's where the exhibit kind of breaks out into a number of chapters that examines all that growth. We start with vintage, an original copy of the newspaper that local folks were reading when war was declared on April 6, 1917. And at that point, everything in Portsmouth would never quite be the same again. We start with a section about how Portsmouth grew physically. Thousands and thousands of workers were needed for shipyard jobs. But it's important to remember, this was the time when there was segregation in how, African Americans could only live in certain parts of town and so forth. So the U.S. government's housing corporation actually built two entire neighborhoods that are still part of Portsmouth today. They were called Truxton and Craddock, and the reason they had to build two was they built one for African American workers and their families and one for white workers and their families. And it's kind of interesting for me to look at we have some of the original graphics of the original plats of what the designs of those neighborhoods were like. This was the very earliest beginnings of American car culture, so not many people owned a car. The actual location of Truxton was supposed to be along a rail line so that the workers could get to the shipyard that way. And we have a wonderful panoramic image that's actually from an original that's very fragile, so we couldn't show the original, but it's from an image that we have at the Naval Shipyard Museum of Craddock in 1920 when the whole town was brand new. There weren't any driveways, there weren't any garages. The houses are just kind of built side by side, and if you see the occasional car, it's parked on the lawn or in the street or something like that. So it's just kind of interesting to look at some of those cultural things. But these whole towns had to be built pretty much immediately. And as you go through the rest of the exhibit, there was an awful lot of construction that had to begin immediately, if not sooner. And a lot of the projects were not finished until after the war was over. So a lot of them were so big and so industrial that they had to continue beyond the war effort before they were finished. But those kinds of things set Portsmouth up basically for the next 100 years in how the shipyard operated and what the town would look like at that time. So we had Truxton and Craddock that appeared on the landscape all of a sudden to support the war effort. If you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men who were suddenly needed either to take a job at the shipyard or get sent off to war, who was left to do the work? Women. And World War I was the first time the Navy admitted women into its reserves, and they were called yeomanettes. And so we have an original yeomanette uniform, again, that's from the Naval Shipyard Museum's collection that's shown. And we also have a panoramic image of those newly hired yeomanettes. There were more than 700 of them who went to work then at the shipyard. Before they even, the picture of them is standing on the shipyard grounds in their regular clothes because uniforms hadn't even been invented yet. And it was a big project to figure out, how are we going to dress women who've never been in the Navy before? So we have an example of one of their uniforms on display. The other thing that really grew during that time period in terms of the shipyard staff was their apprentice program. It's something that still happens today. They take young men, young women who want to learn shipyard trades and crafts and further their education. Well, it was going on, I think the earliest apprentice class was 1913, so it was just before the war happened. So the apprentice program got going on the shipyard. In the exhibit, then we move on to some of the big projects and the big expansions that happened. We've got a section about the hospital. There was some amazing temporary construction that had to happen on the Naval Hospital's grounds right here in Portsmouth. And interestingly, there were hundreds and thousands of sailor recruits that were being brought into training centers all over the country for the Navy. They didn't have the capacity they needed to train sailors fast enough, so training centers cropped up. And there was one right across the river from us here in Portsmouth called St. Helena. Sailor recruits who were brought in were actually subjected to a 21-day isolation period to make sure they weren't sick. They just kind of had to individually stay away from each other for 3 weeks. Because some of the childhood diseases that we think of today as being almost, not an issue, like measles and mumps, spread like wildfire when these young men got together from places all over the country and suddenly found themselves thrown into barracks together. So interestingly, some of the biggest demands on the Naval Hospital at the time were diseases like that recruits were, spreading to each other. Incredible, like I said, incredible temporary constructs on the Naval Hospital grounds, including tents into which, patients had to take their care in a tent instead of inside the building. The Naval Base that we all know about today over in Norfolk didn't exist until World War I. The demands of the war meant that the shipyard could no longer handle ship construction and maintenance as well as training and the operations of a naval base. So this is the point at which the government took over the land where the 1907 Jamestown Exposition had been and gave birth to the Naval Base. And that was the point at which the Navy divided those two kind of responsibilities. So from then on, the shipyard focused on ship construction and maintenance, while the Naval Base focused on active operations and training. And the first complement of sailors for the base literally marched by foot over there in spring of 1917 from St. Helena all the way to the Naval Base. So the birth of the Naval Base was due to the demands of World War I. And on the shipyard itself here in Portsmouth, some of the biggest projects that anyone had ever seen began, including things like Dry Dock 4, which at the time was the largest cement construction project in the world. It was more than 1,000 feet long. A few years earlier, the Navy had done a study and realized it didn't have enough facilities to maintain all the ships it had. And Dry Dock 4 was big enough so that any ship of the Navy up to that point could fit in the dry dock. And we have a series of photos that show how Dry Dock 4 went from a literal hole in the ground to an enormous, state-of-the-art technology dry dock at that time. 2 other dry docks were also built, Dry Docks 6 and 7, and those were kind of interesting because they were built by something called the Emergency Fleet Corporation. So many merchant ships had been sunk by the Germans, essentially, that Europe was starving for supplies, not just supplies for the war, but literally food for citizens. And so those two dry docks were built to build and repair new ships to replace all the ones that had been sunk. And until recently, those were still in use at the shipyard. Dry Dock 4 is still in use today. Behind me is a section that we call serving, which was about being over there. This is the one part of the exhibit where we've got some examples of what soldiers and sailors wore during the First World War period. And we have some photographs, images, and some really great artifacts on display. Some small things a soldier or sailor might have carried, a 1 franc note from France, a French train ticket, a little cigarette lighter. You couldn't carry very much of a personal nature with you. And we've had some wonderful private donors who've given us some things that we have on display, things that you won't see at any other time. So we talk about being over in Europe and wearing these uniforms, and then opposite this section we have a section about what was going on here in Portsmouth, and that's a favorite of mine, just because even though we didn't have a lot of artifacts, there was an enormous amount of activity happening in Portsmouth to support the war effort, and someone bothered to write it all down in a publication called Virginia Communities in Wartime. And it's an amazing publication that we have here in the local history room of the Portsmouth Public Library. And someone really went out into all these communities and talked to church groups and YMCA groups and Sunday school classes and something called the War Camp Community Service, and wrote down to the dollars and cents the money that was raised, the amount of war bonds that were sold, the amount of cooking classes that were held in Portsmouth and Norfolk to teach housewives how to have meatless meals and sugarless meals, because there was rationing, because so much of that had to be provided for the war effort. And we've got some great quotes on the wall that talk about some of the individuals who supported the war with local efforts. There's one account of a woman making enough phone calls to find places to live for 515 people. Shipyard workers who needed an apartment or a cot or a little place to stay. People at home were really busy supporting the war effort, and there are some fascinating accounts of what was going on right here in Portsmouth. And then towards the end of the exhibit, we have a section of the exhibit called Remembering, which is about when peace came, and we have 3 period newspapers on display. The Virginia Pilot, the Norfolk Ledger-Dispatch, and the Portsmouth Star from the day of the armistice, which of course was November 11th, 1918. We even have on display a spent artillery shell that was brought back by a soldier on the field in France. His artillery unit fired that shell at 10:59 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, and so he collected it as a souvenir and scratched that date and time in it. It's from the last minute of the war, and he dragged it all the way back here to Portsmouth, and we're lucky to have it on display. It's another private loan for the duration of the exhibit. And we've got some items on display that talk about the legacy of the soldiers and sailors who served in the war. We've got some medals on display. We have a wonderful 1918 casket flag from a soldier who didn't come back from the war, unfortunately. He was killed in action in France. We have a photograph of him. And we even have a commemorative plaque that St. John's Church here in Portsmouth loaned to us, talking about the congregation members from their church who served in the war. It lists their names, and it's of interest to people who visit the church because it has John Lejeune's name on it, for whom Camp Lejeune is named. And so we've got things like that on display from beyond the war. One of the favorite things that I think a lot of visitors are interested in is a uniform we have on display from a service group that started up after the war was over, called the Military Order of the Cootie. Soldiers who served in the trenches dealt with trench foot, which was, kind of like the athlete's foot of serving in all that muck and mud. That's why their boots and their leg wraps were so important. But they also suffered with what they called cooties, which were essentially head lice, because living in a trench is not a very healthy way to live, and so they had a lot of maladies they had to contend with. So a group of veterans got together to create a service group, and they decided to adopt that as their name and their kind of mascot. And it's a fantastic uniform with an enormous bug on its back, and it's just kind of fun to see. Their mission was to visit veterans in the hospital, visit children's hospitals, and just kind of try to bring community service, as their legacy of being veterans of the war. And we're lucky to have that on display as well. So the exhibit here at the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center is a temporary exhibit. We're all kind of sad about that, but it'll be here until October 9th. And every time Portsmouth has a first weekend, admission is free on first Saturday, and so there's a couple of those left before the exhibit is over. And on Friday nights of first weekend, PAC always has live music in its courtyard, and it's kind of a neat place to come and enjoy. So we just hope that people will really take a moment to come through and see some of the local ways in which Portsmouth affected the war and vice versa, because there really is not a specific monument to World War I that's in Portsmouth. There are all wars memorials and things like that, but if you look at the landscape and you look at the shipyard, you can see the evidence of what World War I did in Portsmouth still on the landscape today. And that's what we're really trying to do with this exhibit, is show how a world war affected one community.
Come stroll the quaint streets of historic Portsmouth to discover treats of all kinds, special sales, and delightful events. It's holiday shopping the way it should be, relaxed, fun, and festive, with so many special, one-of-a-kind stores, unexpected gifts to discover, and truly friendly small business people to help you celebrate the season. So come then to Portsmouth. Shop local, shop small business Saturday in the new Portsmouth.
Historic Old Town Portsmouth has specialty stores that attract visitors from all over the region. Let's pay a visit to Way Back Yonder Antiques with its owner, Ken Woolard.
Hello, my name is Ken Woolard, and welcome to Way Back Yonder Antiques here in beautiful Old Town Portsmouth. I'll tell you a little bit about us. We're located at 462 Washington Street. This is a new address for us. We've been here about a year and a half, and we have moved around the corner off of High Street, and what a neighborhood street we're on. We have the church, and we have the moms pushing babies and joggers, and a very interesting people watching place. Way Back Yonder opened in Chesapeake in 1991, and we're 26 years old this year, and we'll be 27 come November. Very, very proud of that. Prior to this career, I was a department store buyer in Richmond and have an extensive merchandising background, and as you tour around the store, you'll see we have like items with like items, and you'll see our specialties right away. And one of our specialties is sterling silver. And we have one of the finest collections in the region, and it's all purchased out of local homes from private families. And often we have a very good story to tell you about where it came from and where it's lived. And silver is so interesting. I could give an hour-long lecture on what is it. And there's so many unusual serving pieces, such as escargot servers or fried oyster servers or individual asparagus tongs. It's just a fascinating area. And people had formal dinners and the help to go along with it and use these objects. So we'll educate you today on how to use these items today. So not necessarily a formal sit-down dinner, but if you're having a cocktail party, by all means get out those sterling forks and use them. As you look around, you'll notice that we're a general line antique shop, and we have an emphasis on quality. And you'll see our specialties such as estate and antique jewelry, the silver we already talked about, antique glassware, we have Boy Scout items, we have Matchbox cars, we have furniture. So just an interesting array of items, and everything has a history, everything's lasted, it's stood the test of time. And we travel around to area homes. We have a fairly large footprint in the area we buy in. That's roughly a 100-mile radius from here. Often you're going into homes, maybe here in Old Town, and it's an original family home, and it's so exciting when you can visit homes and hold important documents and read about the sea trials of the ironclad ship here in Portsmouth, and it's just a fascinating thing. We've met so many celebrities and famous people over the years. We have sold things to Vanna White and James Avery, and the list goes on and on and on. And so many of these people, including Shania Twain, have been here in Portsmouth, so just very, very nice. Wayback Yonder Antiques moved to Old Town Portsmouth in 1997, and our original location was at 620 High Street, and we have since moved around the corner here and just loving our smart and sensible self. But we were part of the city's initiative called Vision 2005, and the president of the Old Town Business Association and the Portsmouth Redevelopment and Housing Authority actually came to Chesapeake and recruited us, and there was an effort to get a lot of antique shops here. So we're here as the result of that. We purchased properties and renovated them and took advantage of all the tax credits and incentives that are in place to do business here in Portsmouth. Initially, we had to educate our customer base to come to Old Town, and we did have a little resistance, but once they come here, they love it, and they're just amazed at the history here and the number of stores and how friendly and what a small town atmosphere is here in Portsmouth. And we often hear it, and people come to us from all over the world, really. And the Naval Shipyard and the Naval Hospital provides visitors from all over the country. It might be a specific contractor that does XYZ job at the shipyard. They're from Seattle and they come here twice a year, and if they like antiques, they definitely look us up. We pull from a large region: Eastern North Carolina, the Eastern Shore, DC, Richmond, all the way to Emporia. So it's nice to feel like you're part of a region, not just a wonderful city. We're often asked where we find all of these beautiful treasures in this building, and I'm happy to inform you we buy strictly from people's families, and maybe your grandmother's downsizing and getting a condo, and she has a lifetime of accumulation, and maybe her mother's and grandmother's too. So often we go in these homes, and we do not clean out houses, but we definitely buy things of interest and quality. The other way, people bring things to us, and maybe they're just thinning out a bit, or they've collected a certain item for years and years and years, and they're changing gears. So most all of our items, we know where they've come from, where they've lived. We try to tell you who, what, when, and where, as far as how old it is and where it was made. So always a discovery going into people's homes and buying these treasures. And you'll probably never see us at an auction or an estate sale. So the good news there is all this merchandise is fresh, it's fresh to the market, and it hasn't been around in other shops and auctions. Well, thanks for visiting with us today, and please come again and visit us often. We're always finding treasures and something every day. And you can't see it, but right here to my left is a huge mountain of old books. So if you like poetry, I've got it. We must have put 30 editions out onto the floor this week. And also some extensive collection of children's books. And my client is 90 years old, so you have original Raggedy Ann and Andy and original Alice in Wonderland books, and just treasures to be had.
The city's new tourism video showcases all there is to see and do in historic Portsmouth. Let's take a look.
Welcome to Portsmouth, Virginia, a waterfront community that invites you to discover our fascinating history, family fun, outdoor recreation, arts, entertainment, shopping, dining, and colorful special events. Located in the heart of coastal Virginia in the region known as Hampton Roads, Portsmouth is close to Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and Williamsburg. In fact, it's this unique location on one of the world's deepest natural harbors where our story begins. In 1752, merchant and ship owner Colonel William Crawford laid out plans for a new town on the banks of the Elizabeth River that he named in honor of Portsmouth, England. Thanks to Portsmouth's deep natural harbor, the Gosport Shipyard was founded here in 1767. Shipbuilding was the high-tech industry of that time, and Portsmouth quickly became a center of maritime trade in colonial America. As the town grew, wealthy ship owners and sea captains built homes and churches along the waterfront in what is now known as Old Town. During the Revolutionary War, British troops seized Portsmouth because of the strategic importance of the shipyard. But unlike other captured American towns that were burned to the ground, Portsmouth was spared, and that's how Old Town survived. Today, Old Town is the site of one of America's largest collections of architecturally noteworthy 18th and 19th century homes. Visitors stroll Old Town's tree-lined streets to see more than 200 carefully preserved homes and churches. And Old Town's unique specialty stores and one-of-a-kind restaurants make for an enjoyable place to spend the day. But Old Town is more than just a pleasant place to take a stroll. Today, it is home to major attractions that delight the whole family. The Children's Museum of Virginia is the state's largest and most awesome kids' kingdom. Kids step inside a world where bubbles grow large and the forces of nature spark their imagination. They can be a farmer, banker, scientist, or a stargazer. Adults will think they are having an educational experience, but the kids are just having lots of fun. Learn about our maritime history at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard Museum, where you'll find beautiful ship models, military artifacts, and exhibits spanning 250 years of Portsmouth's history. Built in 1915, the lightship Portsmouth was equipped with a beacon that guided mariners off the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Tour the ship's quarters to learn how the men of the lightship service lived during their months at sea. The Fresnel lens on display at the waterfront came from a lighthouse that served Virginia's eastern shore in the 1800s. The Hill House Museum in Old Town is an excellent example of an English basement home that was constructed in the Federal style for a wealthy ship's captain. As the site of a former plantation, Portsmouth's African-American history dates back to near the very founding of the Virginia colony. Before the Civil War, Portsmouth was a pivotal stop on the Underground Railroad, the network of citizens and churches that helped enslaved people escape to the north and freedom. The Emmanuel AME Church in Old Town protected runaway slaves as they waited to be spirited aboard ships heading to New England and Canada. The Portsmouth Community Colored Library Museum brings African American history alive through books, artifacts, hands-on activities, and interactive programs designed to promote pride, cultural diversity, activism, and understanding. The Railroad Museum of Virginia delights rail fans with an early 1900s Norfolk and Western steam locomotive, dining car, caboose, and depot-style platform. The Jewish Museum and Cultural Center houses rare artifacts and exhibits that tell the history of the Hampton Roads Jewish community. If the arts and entertainment are more your style, you've come to the right place. The Portsmouth Pavilion is a riverfront performing arts center that hosts some of the biggest names in show business. With 6,500 seats and a waterfront ambiance, it's the perfect setting for a night of unforgettable entertainment. Housed in the historic 1846 courthouse, the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center presents visual art exhibits, lectures, classes, and performances that bring the works of world-renowned artists to Old Town. The galleries of the Visual Arts Center of Tidewater Community College feature exhibitions by regional and national artists, as well as students and faculty members. If you're looking for some outdoor fun, you'll find it here. Portsmouth is located at mile marker 0 of the famous Intracoastal Waterway. Thousands of sailors and cruisers drop anchor here during their annual migration north and south. And if you would like to get a good look at the Navy ships anchored in the Elizabeth River, hop aboard the ferry that connects Old Town with downtown Norfolk. Bidewee Golf Course is one of the nation's finest public courses. Its soaring pines and immaculate playing conditions earned a 4-star rating from Golf Digest magazine. If you prefer to hike or kayak, Hoffler Creek Wildlife Preserve is just the ticket. This 142-acre wildlife preserve provides a thriving habitat for plants and animals native to Virginia. Paradise Creek Nature Park is a 40-acre urban park of restored forest and wetlands with 2.5 miles of hiking trails. And if you're looking for the perfect site for your group's next meeting, The Renaissance Portsmouth Norfolk Waterfront Hotel is one of the region's finest. Its waterfront location and outstanding service will be a hit with your guests. And finally, Portsmouth loves a good party. Our major annual festivals will put you in the spirit. A year-round lineup of events focused on entertainment, art, music, and food. Just pick your passion and join the fun. Thank you for discovering the new Portsmouth. Please come visit us soon.